Ladies and gentlemen, for the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, there are 3 good reasons to recall the 10th anniversary of the start of a historic development in the Arab countries and to take stock of the experiences related to the developments called or subsumed under the term Arab Spring. As a political foundation, we must and want to take an interest in relevant social developments, also in other countries, that can have an impact or significance for our country. As a German political foundation, we are especially sensitive when it comes to achievements and risks for democracy. And as the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, we follow the developments in transformation countries who have started to give up authoritarian structures, and we are connected to them also in an operational way. We are not only interested in the development of these countries, but we are also committed to the processes taking place wherever we are allowed to do it and where our contribution to these processes is wanted. When you look back 10 years ago, you almost start with the fact that the discrepancy between the expectations and hopes at the time and the realities we see today is sobering. At the time, within a couple of few weeks, civil movement toppled the head of states in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Yemen. And there were 2 other countries where the monarchies remained intact, but the governments were exchanged. Morocco and Jordan. In Bahrain, a similar development was quickly discontinued with the support of Saudi Arabian tanks. So what started then and where it will lead to in the long run, this needs to be assessed by historians in the future. The process that started at the time obviously didn't reach its declared result, and it has also not failed once and for all. Let me tell you something about the special interest the Adenauer-Stiftung has in these countries and their development perspectives. And I want to start the first attempt in Germany to implement a democracy failed early on. It did not lead to the desired stable democratic development. This makes us especially cautious when it comes to the claim of being a role model for other countries, because also in this country divided in a democratic and an autocratic system showed us that each country has to find its own way into the future. So also when we look at our own recent history, we know that the toppling of an authoritarian system does not necessarily lead to stable conditions, and by no means immediately. When surveys are carried out in all the countries affected, big majorities state that the improvement of the economic situation and especially of the job market is the focal target, and this is even considered more important than democracy, and it is not surprising because when you look at the German success story after World War II, you have to ask the question, how quickly could a stable democracy have been established in the 50s and 60s in Germany hadn't there been the economic success story during this process of transformation? In my first sentence, I spoke of the 10th anniversary of the beginning of a historical development in Arabic countries. And I did this to express my expectation and assumption that the process that started then is not yet over. And despite the setbacks of recent years, and which are bigger than the success stories, but nevertheless there is no reason to declare the process that was started then failed. The assumed Arab Spring did not turn into a shining summer, but more into a rough autumn. But, you know, historical comparisons are always difficult. But let me point out a similar process that took place in Europe, not in the Arab world. In 1968, after failed uprisings in East Berlin 1953, in Budapest 1956, an attempt was made to topple an authoritarian regime in Prague in 1968. It failed first like the previous attempts, and another attempt in Poland, Gdansk and Warsaw 12 years later was not successful. But the series of these failed starts led to an irresistible movement of resistance, which allowed the toppling of the communist countries and brought freely elected governments. The Adenauer-Stiftung wants to accompany, support these processes wherever it is allowed to do it. It's no coincidence that from Tunis, we start 3 programs while we have no longer an office in Egypt. This is not due to the significance of the country, but the limited scope of possibilities we have for our work. So we will continue to deal with this subject, and I would like to thank everybody who has organized and participated in this conference. I also want to thank all the activists in the Arab countries for their commitment, hoping that we can continue and reach a successful end. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to all of you who are interested in it using our live stream. I'm Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, the head of the Regional Department Middle East and North Africa, and I will be the facilitator for this panel. First, thank you very much, Professor Lammert, for your opening statement. The core message that it was a historic seizure, the Arab Spring, and it started a process that has not yet been completed today. Where does the region stand today? 10 years after the uprising 2011, what developments are at the horizon and what role can be played by Germany and Europe in stabilizing the development? These are the issues we want to discuss here with Azouz Roubai from Tunisia. He is a scholarship holder of CAS. He is studying at the Erfurt University, and since 2014 he is socially committed in Tunisia. We have Dina Fakusa from the German Council of Foreign Relations, where she heads the Middle East and North Africa program, dealing mainly with political and social transformation processes. Dr. Michael Köhler has joined us from Brussels. He is the Deputy Director General for European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations, and he was the Director for the Southern Neighborship in the EU Commission. We also have Mr. Johan Wadepoel here, the Deputy Chairman of the CDU-CSU parliamentary group responsible for foreign policy and security policy. And last but not least, we have with us Dr. Hamzawi. He studied in Berlin and in Cairo. Currently, he teaches at the Stanford University in the United States. In the first years after the revolution in Egypt, he was a member of the National Assembly, and he is also a well-known expert of the Middle East and North Africa. But before we start with our discussion, I would like to ask Mr. Hamzawi to make an introductory statement to take stock of the development, the events, and the difficult transformation process in the regions. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here with you and Mr. Lammert. I met him for the last time in 2012 in the Egyptian parliament. I'm very pleased to be here with you, Professor Lammert, and to discuss for the next hour. Please allow me, looking back to 4 core issues before we discuss together. As Mr. Lammert has said, in 2011, the uprising in Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, also in Bahrain, I would call them democratic uprising during the first year, or perhaps even the end to the second year. These uprisings were seen in a political way. And this was one of the strategic mistakes made in the region. It were democratic uprising in the meaning of freedom, human rights, but it was also an uprising for bread. People took to the streets because they wanted to improve their living conditions, looking at Tunisia, Egypt, and the different development processes during the last decade. We can see that many of the Egyptian and Tunisian citizens who took to the street were not only thinking of democracy, but also of an improvement of their life. And since this did not happen, so the hope or the belief in democracy also was lost because the condition of life didn't improve. Since 2010-11, it's always a field of tension between democratic demands and socio-economic demands of the people of the region who wanted to have an improvement with regard to the labor market, poverty, and the democratic forces could not, since they could not deliver, then also hope into the democratization was lost or given up, and sometimes they even went into the other direction, so re-authoritarian rule. This becomes clear in Egypt, but also the current developments in Tunisia show this hopelessness. Current surveys show this very clearly. So it was this relationship of tension between democracy, rule of law, and the very legitimate demands of the citizens to improve the social economic situation. And a second aspect I would like to mention is the fact that the whole regional situation was marked by the difference between strong, solid state units and weak units. You cannot explain why in Egypt until today, and despite the democratic developments, why the authoritarian state remained relatively stable, still provides certain services, also in the crisis situation of the pandemic. This solid state apparatus is in contrast to the weak state apparatus in other countries, Libya, Yemen, because of the combination of ethnical diversity and a military dictatorship that has ruled for decades in the interest of a minority. This conflict explains why the democratic uprising led to a collapse of national state structures, leading to civil war in certain countries. So a weak national apparatuses that tried to master the security pressure but couldn't do so. This also showed the contradiction between stable and unstable state entities. And this was not prioritized. You can not have democracy without a political framework. If the framework collapses, then especially in Libya, Yemen, and Syria, the situation becomes very difficult. And a third point, and here I also refer to the second wave of uprising that started in 2018, 1920, until the outbreak of the pandemic has defined the conditions in 4 countries. So there is the first and the second wave, and it's important to point out the formal and informal way. Sudan, among the countries of the second wave, seems to have good opportunities to achieve a long-term democratization process. When we compare the Sudan to Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, and the sectarian nature of the policies, if we compare it, for instance, then you find that Sudan, with strong civil society actors, has a good opportunity for democratization, and this is exactly the difference we saw between Tunisia and Egypt. In Tunisia, the actors have saved the democratization process and this didn't exist in Egypt. To So the civil society was stronger in Tunisia, but this is a critical tension you must consider when you discuss the region. It's about the formalization or the lack of structures of the civil society actors. My last point is the fact that when we look at the development of the transformation processes in the region, then we also note that, like the euphoria at the beginning that might not have been justified, uh, not justified morally, but also not politically and socially. In the same way, the fact that you withdraw democracy as the ultimate target, or that you forecast that the democratization process has failed. This is also not justified in many countries, as Mr. Lammert said, after the beginning of the autumn, that you say, well, it was doomed to failure in the first place. The euphoria was wrong, but also to forecast long-term failure is also wrong. And in concluding, let me say, when you look at Tunisia, despite major economic difficulties, or when you look to Algeria or Egypt, etc., then you see that there is still a demand for democracy and a better living conditions. You notice that people are still interested in politics in Iraq and in Lebanon. It's very courageous what people tried in 2018, 19 to look at the structural conditions and to try to stop it, and to were striving for a post-sectarian system. There is still some hope. The euphoria was not justified, and a long-term failure is also not justified. So here I want to stop, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Hamzawi. That has been a rather educating presentation. If we should sum up your presentation, one might say that the region finds itself in a phase of disorder, especially with regard to the social systems that organize politics and the economic life. There is some progress and there are some setbacks. Now I would like to ask Mr. Wadepool to join us. This kind of disorder also applies to the model of an order in the region which is not yet fully developed. How do you see, from the foreign policy point of view, how do you judge the region today? Thank you very much for your friendly introduction. I come from a voting session in the Bundestag, and Professor Lammert knows all these formalities. I'd like to welcome him warmly. Professor Lammert could not follow. I'd like to invite and thank you for the invitation, also for the cooperation of all the many years with the Adenauer Foundation in the at the headquarter in Berlin and the many offices, and also with the parliamentary group. Without your help, we would not be able to have accomplished all our activities in the region. I also would like to give a rather diverse summary. In Tunisia, we do see some success of democratic change, and in terms of a liberal constitution, we can observe careful reforms. And in Morocco and in Mauritania, in Egypt, as Dr. Hamza, we also indicated, there is not that much of a political opening, but there is more a status of safety or security organs, and we see a dramatic situation in Libya and Syria. They have really collapsed in the process of the civil war in these countries, and it is difficult to draw up a positive future for them at the moment. I don't think that the Arab Spring is over. It was not one spring, or it was not a completed period of time. I think the world of Arab states is still in a change of upheaval. There are now, as before, the problems existing that led to the riots, rising cost of living, unemployment among the youth, rampant corruption. All these things still exist, and in these states there is still a great preparedness for reforms and political change in terms of good governance. These are still the reasons why the women are, sorry, why the governments are still weak. The countries have changed, and also the demonstrators have learned a lot since 2011. The urge for reforms and has really become strengthened, and these ideas still are developed by the people, even much more today than 10 years ago, thanks to social networks and social media, uh, as we didn't know it in the past. This also adds to the discontent with the policymakers, because the problems have not been overcome. And I think the German foreign policy as Europeans means that we should see ourselves as partner for sustainable structural reforms in the field of business life in these countries, because the values behind these movements are correct. These are European values which we consider valid all over the world: human rights, the rule of law, and all that is needed. And we also have to say that this is also an issue of foreign and security policy matters for Germany. So stability in this region means a lot for Germany. I think as for Germany, like for no other country on earth, we have suffered from these instabilities, as for example the problem of refugees. So structural reforms are still needed, and we have to insist in them. Otherwise, there won't be stability. Otherwise, the discontent among the people will not be ended, and uh, these countries could not be helped in areas where investments are needed. I think otherwise people cannot be convinced to become active in these countries because that will be the prerequisite for a new economic upswing. And therefore, we have to insist that these reforms, not revolutions, that these reforms do happen, and we also have to realize, like in other areas, that the uh, corona pandemic has become a catalyzer. It augments the need for action, for new rules of action very much. Secondly, we also hope for an approach of partnership. Europe as its entirety, including Germany, are not only thinking in terms of regions or spheres of influence, that's what others do, but we have an interest in the stability, as I said. I think despite all partnership in the future, I have to say all what we um, offer as support, we will do in the field of economic development or good governance or the rule of law principles. Then we are here to act as partners. Of course, there are competitors. We are not alone in the world. Among those who want to become active and who are prepared to assist you, this includes two, especially China. China needs to be mentioned everywhere. China is prepared to become active, and also many Gulf states. This is a difference, of course, to our kind of commitment, as we have to say realistically. These two competitors, as we see them, who are prepared to become active there, do not have such a conditioned approach. They do not say we only will help you if changes are made in the political sphere, but they have other conditions they attach. They have conditions that they, in terms of expectations, they expect these countries that they mm, subordinate themselves to the donor states like China and their sphere of interests, and that they subordinate to the Chinese economic interests. So in this tension of competition, we are working, as we have to say realistically. I think Europe can play and has to play an important role in this field. But I think that is what I would say are 10 years after the events. I think that is a realistic analysis. Mr. Wadepool, allow me a question. You said correctly that there are competitors. Yes, indeed, until some years ago, the European investments, European cooperation was offered, and European money was donated to these countries. And today, these countries can make use of Chinese investments and money from the Gulf states and weapons from Russia. What does that mean? What will that tell us with regard to the kind of shaping these countries? The hierarchy of power in the region has changed dramatically in recent years. This is correct. This is really correct, and this is a major challenge for us. To add something positive on the development of the past 10 years, of course, in many political processes, we are still involved. Let me think of Libya or the conference we held in Berlin, headed by the Federal Chancellor. Of course, we supported this conference also by Macron in the process of actions guided by the UN. I think we will also have a meeting of the Joint Commission of the JCPOA agreement with Iran, where the three countries, Germany, France, and Britain, have always played an important role. I'm sure they will do so in future too. We, with regard to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, we are also involved in the negotiations. Of course, we have to start very quickly with the Biden administration on the distribution of roles in the future. I'm realistic. A Biden administration will not return to early times when the United States played a very part as a strong ruler in the Middle East. There is no longer a dependency on oil or the security political interests or the security policy needs. They have other kind of problems. I think for Europe and Germany, it means a lot to become a power of change. We have never had an hegemonistic interest. We have a partnership interest, but that would mean to assume more responsibility. I think we suffered a lot as a result of the civil war in Syria. Or let's take Libya or Iraq. We will help militarily, diplomatically, and also economically. If we don't do so, we must not be surprised if we suffer under the consequences. But it's true, China and Russia use other means. They use mercenaries or they supply weapons. Europe would never do that, and that's why we also have to make sure that these countries realize that Europe is a different kind of partner, I think a better partner, or a sustainable partner, to use a modern terminology, as compared to China or Russia. Thank you very much, Mr. Wadepool, for having taken the time in these hectic days of parliamentary work. Thank you for your short keynote. Have a nice evening. Now I would like to return to the panelists directly. Let me get one step back and come back to Tunisia again. Azus Rebai. In all the three presentations, we have heard that Tunisia is the role model country, but even there, the developments had to pass through difficult times and a thorny path. Well, you are 26 years of age. That means you belong to the generation of the Tunisian revolution, and you have been active in the political society. Let me ask you, therefore, how have you personally experienced the past decade?
And thank you for the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for choosing this subject. This subject is important for my country, for my region, and for the generation I belong to. So first, let's start from the beginning. As it was mentioned, the Arab Spring, what was called the Arab Spring, started in Tunisia and spread to a lot of Arab countries in the MENA region. But after 10 years, it's fair to say that it was a beginning of a Tunisian spring, but it turned to be a cold winter in a lot of countries. Because I don't want to be pessimistic, but when I have in mind images of conflicts, civil wars, and armed conflicts and violence, it can't be a spring. So from a personal perspective, I had the opportunity, like a lot of Tunisian young people, to be active politically and to engage in a lot of civic society organization. And the Tunisian revolution opened up space for us for freedom and democracy. But what is important for me to understand and to point is why we could manage this political transformation in Tunisia. So I think there is three main factors. First, education, because the Tunisian people are well educated, and it is a consequence of reforms that was made 60 years before, after the independence with the President Bourguiba. And so we generalized education, we unified education, and education is for all and free for 60 years. Second thing, and for me it's the most fundamental thing, is the role of Tunisian women. And it's also a consequence of reforms that was made a long time before. And Tunisian women are in the same level as men in the constitution and even in different working sectors. And I think they played a major role in the political transformation in Tunisia. Third thing, and it was mentioned by Mr. Hamzawi, is that the political Tunisian actors didn't use violence to resolve their political conflict. They used a dialogue, a peaceful dialogue, and it was the national dialogue hosted by four civil society organizations, mainly the trade union, and they find a solution. And even this process was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2015. And so the last thing I want to say is, even we had this political transformation, the democratic process is still endangered because we didn't manage to have an economic transition. And so democracy without economic results can't stay protected. So in order to protect the democratic process and the Tunisian experience, we have to create economic opportunity, especially for young people, and end up with this rent-seeking economy and give more opportunities to young people.
Ich glaube, hier eine
One important message here is that, yes, indeed, in Tunisia, a rather vivid civic society has been formed quickly and has responded to the political processes and accompanied them in the following years. I'd like to ask Dina Fakusa, what is the situation in the other parts of the region? What about the civic society there? Because that is an area of particular concern for Europe and Germany when it comes to the support of the civic society. Thank you very much, Kanan, and I'd like to thank the Adenauer Foundation particularly. Well, as regards the civic society, we have heard a lot in the other panels about the civic society and its importance, and that there is still great hope. Let me just add one more thing. The civic society is not per se a good thing in the sense of organizations or groupings within this civic society that have a rather a special agenda in Lebanon. This sectarianism can also be observed within this civic society. In the Iraq, it's the same. Let me just say we have to be careful when we talk about the civic society. When I worked in Lebanon, we did have to look very closely how the political situation was like, so as not to fail with a good intention and to avoid aggravating the situation. Let me add one more point on the civic society. Dr. Amzawi mentioned the difference between Egypt and Tunisia. The civic society has not managed, like in Tunisia, to become an engine of change. I'm not quite sure about that, because Egypt does have a strong civic society, or it did have in 2011. But the problem was that there was a lack of leadership persons in the civic society. But in Egypt, the counter-revolution was rather strong. Tunisia, fortunately enough, does not have such a powerful military. Tunisia is not that significant from the region political point of view. Um, the civic society plays an important role in other countries, like in Morocco. Here we also do see certain cutbacks or difficulties for those people who do not work politically anymore. There is a clear repression there as well. But the civic society, as we know it, does not exist in the Gulf states. There are some beginnings, there are some organizations, also in the countries of autocratic systems, like in Saudi Arabia. There are some actors and players that are trying to play that role. But of course, a civic society can only breathe in a certain setting. So that is very important, and it depends on the country we talk about. So that will determine the room for maneuvering. Let me also add, as for Germany, it is very important, as it is for Europe as well, that the civic society is to be supported as an engine of change. But the problem is we do support it. We have wonderful programs at the bilateral region or the European level, education measures on networking. We do work on subjects, decentralization programs for various actors, or ecology topics, or programs for entrepreneurs. We have a wonderful program and analyses, but the problem is that at the same time, we have to deal with the rulers. We do not only cooperate with them, but we somehow nearly embrace them or court them. And those are the rulers who are destroying our work to some extent. So we insist in the civic society, and that will be destroyed partly and fully by the rulers in the countries of autocratic or semi-autocratic systems, who are afraid of the civic society, of course, because they want to retain the status quo and their model of power.
Now I have to give the floor to Michael Köhler. Dr. Köhler, the EU is the biggest donor in the region. It invested a lot in the civil society. And after we have heard Dina Fakusa, I have to ask you, what did Europe do correctly or wrongly? Thank you, Dr. Attilgan, and thank you to the Adenauer-Stiftung, Professor Lammert. I'm pleased to be here again. Actually, I started my career 33 years ago with the Adenauer-Stiftung, and I'm very pleased that we are still on speaking terms. First, let me say, I can only agree to what Mr. Wadefuhl and Mrs. Fakusa have said, but I think we must be very clear that this region is not just one object of foreign policy, but it's our neighbor. You may forget it when you are in Berlin, and I find this surprising because given the consequences of the Syrian crisis, we should have noticed that we are directly affected by developments in the Arab region. From a European perspective, you know that we are direct neighbors: Sicily, Tunisia, Greece and Lebanon or Syria, Spain and Morocco, etc. This means that whatever happens there has an impact on us, and our developments also impact this region. The big economic crisis 2008 and also the COVID pandemic have real effects. The socio-economic possibilities are a consequence. When Europe coughs, North Africa gets pneumonia. So it's very important, given the neighborship, the socio-economic relations, the people. I think you are in Berlin. How many people with Turkish background live in Berlin? And here in Brussels, there are very whole neighborhoods, so we have very close relations. So it's not our choice whether we are committed. We cannot wait until a country that is our neighbor gets the political leaders we want to see. There have been several attempts to say, if you do not comply with democratic rules of the game, then we will no longer support you. George W. Bush tried this after 9/11, but such attempts can only last for less than 12 months. Then geopolitics comes into play. And what we now see, many new actors in the region like China, Russia, but also the United Arab Emirates or Turkey. This means the big geopolitical actors, like for instance the US, withdrew. And when you withdraw, reality catches up with you. So the Foreign Policy Council of the EU and now discusses the issue of the southern neighborship, and in 3 months' time they will discuss it again on the basis of a paper that is currently being developed. So we need to cooperate with the region. Just imagine we would say, as long as the regimes are not to our liking, we stop cooperation. How can we then work together at the problem of irregular migration, security, and anti-terrorism? How can we seize the existing opportunities? Germany discusses, for instance, how to establish hydrogen partnerships with Africa. So what we need to do is that the trends, the structures, and the civil societies need to be strengthened, but without burning the bridges we have with those who have the say in the region. And this is the reason that we are not discussing black and white. We all know there are at least 50 shades of gray. So it depends on the shade of gray, and then you can differentiate. It is no surprise, thinking of financial cooperation, that Tunisia gets 3 to 4 times more European development aid compared to Egypt. This is a clear message, and this also applies, for instance, to the Erasmus program for scholarships of North African students, but we cannot turn our back on the region. Geopolitical realities is the keyword. Dr. Hamzavi, let me ask you, many extraterritorial or territorial actors are there. What is their impact on the struggles within the society. Allow me first to explain why I always look to the right or the left. I have my daughter here and she listens very carefully. It's the second meeting she attends. Last time she said, well, she noticed that the comments are too long, so I try to be brief in order to please my daughter and perhaps also you. Strategically, the region can not only be seen from a European or a Chinese perspective, but also from a Middle East perspective. Some actors of the region have a lot of influence. For instance, Syria. The development of the Syrian uprising that became a civil war, and this cannot be decoupled from the Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates played a very relevant role in Egypt, but also in Tunisia. The same applies to Turkey in Libya. Turkey also at other regional focal points during the last decade. Since 2011, there have been camp struggles. On the one hand, the forces of the status quo, led by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and on the other hand, not necessarily forces of democratic change, but regional forces that act to destabilize the situation. Iran, you find everywhere where there is a hot spot in Iran, in Syria. I don't think that they have a stabilizing effect on the conflicts, the civil wars in different countries. So leading to a crisis. Geostrategically, it's correct that we do not only take the external perspective. It's not only Europe or the US, it's also about regional actors who either by force of money, their geostrategical position, were very active in the region. No camp acted to promote a democratization process. So Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were on the one hand. The difference between the civil society in Tunisia and in Egypt. You know, in Egypt, when the uprising occurred, there was a very diverse civil society, but unlike in Tunisia, the civil society in Egypt had or has two weak points. On the one hand, there is a struggle between religious and secular actors, and this is still felt today, unlike in Tunisia, where cross-religious approaches always existed and played an important role in 2012-13. So the ideological struggle in Egypt and also in the Egyptian civil society, and unlike in Tunisia, it was mainly NGOs located in urban centers, not in the rural areas. We always had weak organizations in the rural areas. And when you look to Tunisia, you will see that trade unions and also umbrella trade unions played a very important role. So this is an organization that is deeply rooted in the rural regions. Let me come back to the geopolitical realities. It's always something that is being mentioned when it comes to the question, how can Europe reconcile its values and interests? So in this area, it's a very difficult endeavor. Egypt can serve as an example here. Dina Fakusa, France, awarded the highest prize to the head of state. How do you see this? Thank you very much. I think this is really a shame, but we Germans are also responsible. The Egypt ambassador to Berlin also got the German Cross of Merit, and both sides, both countries said, well, it's our tradition. And I want to answer to what Mr. Köhler has said. Well, what you said, we turn the back to them. This is a very extreme scenario. You also mentioned shades of gray. And to do something like this is a blow into the face for all those who work for human rights in these countries. As a non-diplomat, I would say these things should be dispensed with, and the three staff members of the Egyptian Organization for Human Rights were arrested, but now they are set free. They said, well, they do not expect a systemic change. This has come from inside, but what they want is symbols. I mean, such an embrace of the leaders is weakening the civil society. What we want to achieve in the economic financial sphere, I have to try to connect it to small steps as to more transparency, more state structures. These are very small steps. I know that attempts are being made with regard to development cooperation. Mr. Lammert said people want to have prosperity and jobs, and democracy can come as a second step. So for me, there is no real progress in economic, social, financial sphere without democratic elements. Just an example, we need creative people to do analysis. We need research that is free, is when it comes to labor market reform. We need free actors that can tell the government where the problems lie. We also need the civil society to enlighten the population. So we will not be able to achieve reforms in both areas without democratic elements. My impression is that there is some fatigue among politicians to try it out. I mean, they say these are very difficult rulers, and they probably do not care what happens to their people, but they will not be allowed to be forced onto their knees. What I consider important is always to include small steps. There is something very great. The EU global rights sanction document that was approved by the European Parliament last week. When it comes to sanctions, the point is not that if I cannot change political behavior, I give up my values. No, it's important that we show our values. And in a world full of populism, of authoritarianism, it is important to show your color. We need them to work together in the fight against terrorism. So both leaders want to establish the caliphate. No participation, no socio-economic justice, a state that doesn't deliver, torture in the prisons. So this really is disillusioning, and it promotes radicalism. I wish that we also deal with legal migration. We have this special act for specialist migration, and I think only 8,000 specialists are the target. I do not know what it is. Are we afraid? These are very valuable incentives for Tunisia, for Egypt, and if we could do more, we can also ask something in return. I'm talking about very small steps.
Thank you. Now I'd like to ask Azuz. They say that the international motto is support the youth. So if you want to push ahead development in the region, what does it mean? It means to create perspectives for the young people. It means young people want this, but they don't want that. What do young people want? What do you wish to have as a young Tunisian for a lucky future?
I'll try to stay 3 minutes. So first, we have to distinguish, and we have to note that young people are not the same within the country. So we find young people who, two categories. So the first category are the ones who just want to leave the country, not because they don't love Tunisia, but because they don't find opportunities to build a normal economic and social life. And within this category, we find the ones who are well educated, but apply for a visa, get their visa, and eventually come here to Europe in order to study, to work, and build their life here. And they don't want to come back to their country. So the lack of opportunities push them out of the country. Let's take an example. For instance, let's take the example of a Tunisian engineer who can be paid 5 or 6 times higher here. So it is safe to assume that only really committed young people will stay there and build their life there. And within the same category, we find the ones who are not well skilled, without any particular skills, and without any economic opportunity on the ground. So these young people end up facing drugs, extremism, and the sea being illegal migration or even death. But in the second category, we find the ones who are really committed and who want to try to apply what once President Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And so this young generation learned a lot in these 10 years. So we learned how to organize, we learned how to be sustainable financially, and we learned how to pressure authorities and also to be change makers in the different fields we work in. And this generation of young people is preparing to be the frontline actors in the upcoming years. So to sum up things, I would say that young people just want to live a normal life, having a normal economic opportunities, having a social life, and having a stable environment to build their future. I know it can take times, it can take a lot of time, and it's difficult to make it, but the only solution to have people staying in their country and being satisfied with their life there is to create economic and social opportunities.
Thank you, Azuz. Michael Köhler.
Michael Köhler, what opportunities and instruments does the EU have in order to support these ambitions that have just been described by Azuz Rabai? To support these aspirations and to create conditions, what are the programs of Europe in this regard? Let me just say that I agree with the analysis of Dina Fakusa. I'd say the lack of coherence of policies at the EU of the EU and the EU member states. It's not Brussels that awards decorations. It is not Brussels that carries on with payments to certain countries. To Egypt, we have no renewed programs we have signed with Egypt for a long time because the Egyptian government is not in a position to sign the human rights clause we have in our regulations, or that other member states have not carried on with the bilateral cooperation with Egypt. The question is an important question because we may discuss for a long time whether the word Arab Spring is appropriate or not, or whether the Arab Spring is over or not. But what stands behind this issue is that there is a tremendous transformation of the society in the Arab world. And this huge transformation that will carry on throughout the century will include democratic development. Since 2010, for the first time, we have more people at the southern fringe of the Mediterranean than the northern part. For the first time, we have more people south of the Mediterranean than north of the Mediterranean. That will continue well, beyond our generations. Mr. Rabai is 26 years old. That's an interesting age, because when you look around in the whole Arab world, I'm not only talking about Tunisia, in the whole Arab world, the proportion of the population from 1 to 26% account for 70% of the population. So we talk about the chances young people must have. We don't talk about the same when we talk about youth promotion schemes in Germany. We are talking about the entire society. When 70% of the society are young people that need to be supported education-wise and so on, who are not yet married, who are not yet settled. And that is why it is so important to address the issue of jobs. That is so important for the whole life. That's recognized by all governments, be it a democratic or an undemocratic government. Socio-economic conditions have to be created for the people. That is only possible by job creation, and that does not fall out of the blue. Jobs cannot be sanctioned. We have to, well, create the economic realities, which needs two things. We need an atmosphere so that this is recognized within these countries themselves. We would not be required to support Egypt economically if they would be capable themselves. So we would need investments that will support the creation of jobs. And at the same time, this brings me back to what the previous speaker said. We need sufficient trust in the state of the rule of law, trust in the civic society, because without these opportunities, without a certain participation or like trade unions and freedom, investments will follow. Definite investments that are protected by the state only wouldn't help. The problem is not that certain major investments are landed by the governments. That's what they sometimes do. The problem is that a small business person does not invest there because he would not be protected enough, or his business. So what is needed for the region is socioeconomic progress. To get it, we need not only support programs, which we have, but we need reforms more especially. And the big problem, the biggest reason is that the reason why the many efforts of the European Union, the United States, the UN and many others over the past 30 years or so were not efficient enough, especially in the Arab countries, is due to the lack of reforms in these countries. If the governments are not moving towards more rights, guarantees for entrepreneurship and employees, free courts, then all reform programs which we do have will not become very efficient. As for Tunisia, this is a success story now as before. Tunisia, here we could see how it is seen internationally, how it has changed. Tunisia is a country for over 20 years. It has entered into a free trade zones with the European Union, and that receives a lot of support funds from the EU, Germany, France, and so on. But now, as before, there is still a loss of market shares to competitors who, like countries like Bangladesh, who do not have the same access. So there is a lack of competitiveness, there's a lack of innovation, there's a lack of modern investments, and this is to do with the fact that entrepreneurs do not want to become active there. One final anecdote, sorry for the time. 2 years ago, I met a French entrepreneur who has supported renewable energy products all over the world, even in Mali, which is a difficult country. I asked him, would you also be prepared to invest in Tunisia? And he said, no, Tunisia is too risky. As a Frenchman, relations with Tunisia are close with a country like in no other parts of the region. So if in these countries have to introduce a policy of reforms, as Professor Lammert also mentioned earlier, there are more and more countries that have entered into a phase of crises, although we need more democratization. Mr. Köhler, let me quickly ask a provocative question by the end. Tunisia is the country, the only country, that has signed a free trade agreement with the EU. Why actually did the EU not manage to help Tunisia get a bigger market access, or did I get you wrong? Well, I have to explain that a bit more in detail. Most of the countries, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, with the exception of Libya, have a free access to the European market for industrial products for the past 15 to 20 years. The extended free trade agreement, this is the kind of free trade agreements. What they would add would the free trade to other areas than production, for example, agricultural produce and services. According to our analysis, be it correct or not, it revealed that for the Tunisian or the Moroccan economy, such an agreement would help add to an economic growth and jobs. But we see that the interest in both countries, Tunisia and Morocco, we have negotiations with both countries, that in the service sector and in the agricultural sector or in the field of tourism and the finance industry, no political majorities could have been found for such an agreement. Therefore, the European Union has such agreements with Moldova, Georgia, and the Ukraine, but not with Tunisia. Then we are prepared to negotiate a different agreement if it suits better the interests of Morocco or Tunisia. But we are still waiting for a signal of entering into cooperation. Thank you, Dr. Köhler. Let me quickly grant the floor to Dr. Hamzawi again, because Egypt was mentioned several times. Then I'm left with one final question to the whole panel, and we are left with only 3 minutes. So please support me, Dr. Hamzawi.
Aus meiner Sicht zu dieser Thematik nur anmerken, dass das, was eingangs von Herrn Lammert, aber auch von anderen Teilnehmern unter Governance gesagt wurde, eine große Bedeutung für die Region hat. Wenn man genau die Entwicklungen in der Region beobachtet in den letzten 10 Jahren, es entstehen verschiedene Regierungsmodelle, darunter auch eben interessante Modelle ohne Demokratisierungsversuche. Die Vereinigten Arabischen Emirate zum Beispiel, da merken wir die Technokratisierung des Regierungsgebildes mit einer niedrigen Korruptionsschwelle und mit einer beeindruckenden Dienstleistung, mit einem beeindruckenden Dienstleistungsgebilde dazu. In Saudi-Arabien, jenseits der des autoritären Werdegangs der letzten Jahre, es gibt auch eben einen Versuch, Saudi-Arabien als modernen Staat, also autoritär, aber modernen Staat zu etablieren und zu entkoppeln von dem religiösen Establishment. Es handelt sich um eine Technokratisierung, die auch eben zu einer Verbesserung wirtschaftlich, aber auch gesamtgesellschaftlich jenseits der Politik in Ägypten seit 2013 geführt hat. Ich möchte nur sagen, dass wir wirklich bei allem Respekt für die anderen Sichtweisen, man kann Governance, man kann die sozioökonomischen Problemfelder der Region nicht nur unter den Deckmantel der Demokratisierung einordnen. Das ist ein Fehler aus meiner Sicht strategisch von zivilgesellschaftlichen Akteuren in der Region, die 2011 gemacht wurde und die dazu geführt hat, dass man Vertrauen in die Demokratisierungsprozesse verlor. Sonst wäre 2013 in Ägypten nicht möglich gewesen. Das war auch teilweise eine Antwort an die demokratischen Kräfte, die wirtschaftlich nichts für die Menschen gemacht haben, die Arbeitslosigkeit verlächtert gesehen hat und die Armutsgrenze verlächtert gesehen hat in den 2 Jahren des Wandels. Ich möchte nur, dass dann auch eben, das bleibt ein Spannungsfeld in der Region und darf nicht unter den Deckmantel der Demokratie eingeordnet werden.
Informationen loswerden. Und zwar, wir haben im Rahmen unseres Regionalprogramms
Well, in our framework, we have a survey in the countries of the region, and among other things, the question for the popularity of countries was asked from the region, but also from outside the region. The good news is Germany enjoys the greatest respect by far. That means that Germany can apparently assume a greater role in the region. But I'd like to wind up with the question, what positive developments can we currently recognize, and what could be a positive agenda for the region at the moment? In what direction could we imagine a positive agenda? I'm aware this is a difficult question, but I would like to ask you to just use 30 to 40 seconds to mention the most important key points relating to development in the region. So let me start with Asus.
Main points. I think the first thing, we have to succeed in making a generational transition in political responsibilities. First. Second, we have to create economic and social opportunities for young people in order to stay in their country, to work in their country, and to build their country. Third thing, and it's very important, and I experienced it in my country, is to empower women. Empowering women is a key for democratization and for building the society. And after that, and in these 3 challenges, Europe and our partners can help us. But we have also one challenge, which is for us, because like I would say, you can't be more Catholic than the Pope. So we have to do our job, and our job is to rebuild a common destiny and a common dream without our nation. We need this dream for our young people, and I'm confident with the support of our partners, we will make for at least Tunisia a success story. Thank you.
Danke, Asus. Dina.
Dina, bitte. I've been working for 15 years now about the region and in the region together with the civic society, and we have seen excellent, several punctual successes. We have a change of mind of a community as far as rights for girls and women is concerned. In certain local administrations, we have really achieved something, and the people are capable of achieving something. What we do not manage is, from a political or a societal point of view, a meta level needs to be created, and for this economic reforms are needed. I'd wish we would have a green thread in terms of ecological movements throughout all these subjects. This is a topic which is of existential importance, and this topic cannot be negotiated away. It will happen. It will kill us. We would have to see or look for ways of mutual strengthening and help. I think that would be a subject which has a positive connotation. It is, of course, something we have to discuss at an equal level. That is something which concerns us all. Dr. Hamzawi. Half a minute.
Ich würde mir wünschen, dass man
Ich würde mir
denkt, dass es wichtig ist, seit
I would wish that it is important under autocratic or less autocratic signs that we work in terms of stabilization for a nation, that the rule of law is stressed. There are many examples in the region where, under the disguise, a certain rule of law is achieved, and that there is a lot of foreign investments from abroad, which we do need in order to create jobs, of course. I also would wish that we pay attention to symbolism, and that this field of tension of economics on the one hand and democratic policies is something that has to be seen both from the political and economic point of view. I'd be happy that both things, depending on the final point, is considered. Egypt perhaps would only offer economic NP points. This is justified, not only because of the geopolitical position. Last but not least, Michael Köhler. I agree with all what you've said. That makes things easy for me. We know when the Arab Spring started. We don't know when it will end. That's why I believe we have to do two things, as Dina said. We have to work even more vehemently for common interests. We have to build these common interests like climate change. In 100 years' time, the Nile Delta would be over flooded in 100 years' time because of climate change. So we have to know what to do. Secondly, we have to build as many bridges as we can, because we cannot simply hope for the good ones among the elite with whom you can work. In the Lebanon, we see that a whole elite, despite the catastrophe in the country, would not be enough. But that means we have to build bridges to connect us with young people like Azu. In many other areas, like in the field of academia or business or charity networks, we have to include all representatives of the society. We have to explain to them that Europe is a partner, that Europe wants to work with you. We have to master our destiny together. And this needs a lot of commitment from Europe, and that means that in Berlin we should discuss about the Mediterranean region more often. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you for the interesting and exciting discussion we have had, and that gave us a lot of inspiration for our work in the Stiftung. And I also would like to say that today's event is the opening event for a series of other activities we have prepared in Germany and other countries. We would be pleased if you stay connected with us on the screens to attend the future events as well. I wish you all a pleasant evening, Merry Christmas, and stay healthy.